6 months later, Callum Wren stood in the great brood hall of Vreth Prime, and tried very hard not to fall over. The hall was enormous, carved from black stone that shimmered with veins of bioluminescent mineral, and it stretched so far in every direction that the ceiling vanished into shadow, and the far walls were suggestions rather than facts. And it was filled with thousands of Vrethkai, every one of them taller and more armored and more dangerous than the last, and every single one of them was looking at him. He was wearing a formal uniform that someone had tailored specifically for him. Dark fabric with silver thread that apparently symbolized something important in Vrethkai culture. And it fit perfectly, and he hated it, because it did not have enough pockets, and the collar was too tight. On his shoulders sat Bug. She was not called Bug anymore, not officially. She was Kavrethis Saran, crown princess of the Vreth Ascendancy, heir to 900 worlds. And she had grown in 6 months from a trembling, feverish thing that fit in his arms, to a lively, chattering creature the size of a human toddler, whose scales shone like liquid gemstone in every color the light touched. She was sitting on his shoulders, pulling his hair, and making a sound that he had learned was laughter. And she was completely unconcerned by the fact that the most powerful beings in a quarter of the galaxy were assembled below her. The galaxy had been in shock for weeks. The Vreth Ascendancy, one of the oldest and most feared empires in known space, had extended an offer to humanity that had never been given to any species in the history of their civilization. A full kinship pact. The diplomats who studied such things explained that this was not a trade agreement, or a non-aggression treaty, or any of the ordinary arrangements that species made when they decided not to destroy each other. This was something far deeper, a bond that in Vrethkai culture was equivalent to declaring another species as family, as broodkin, as blood. It meant protected status across 900 worlds. It meant full trade access and shared technology and mutual defense. It meant that any attack on humanity would be treated as an attack on the Ascendancy itself. And it meant that somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of galactic politics, a door had opened that no one had expected and no one could close. Human ambassadors had arrived on Vreth Prime in a state of bewildered gratitude, surrounded by advisors who kept asking each other what was happening, and none of them could explain it. The other galactic powers were even more confused, sending intelligence operatives and analysts and scholars to try to understand what leverage humanity had used, what secret deal had been struck, what hidden weapon had been deployed. They wrote reports and built models and debated in council chambers from one end of the galaxy to the other. None of them came close to the truth. The truth was standing in the great brood hall with a princess on his shoulders and hair that would not stay flat no matter how many times he combed it. Queen Regent Rythan entered the hall through the great doors at the far end, and she was nothing like the broken creature Callum had found against his landing strut on a dead moon. She stood at her full height, all 8 feet of her, clad in living armor that moved with her body like a second skin, her compound eyes blazing with the cold fire of absolute authority. Her 4 arms adorned with the ceremonial bands of the ruling brood, and she moved through the parting crowd like a warship cutting through water. The hall fell silent. Rythan ascended to the speaking platform, a raised disk of polished stone at the center of the hall, and she stood there for a moment, looking out over her people. And then she began to speak. She spoke in Old Vrethkai first, the formal language of empire, and then in Galactic Common so that the human delegation could understand. And her voice filled the hall the way the sea fills a harbor, deep and vast and impossible to ignore. She told them about the Iron Clutch and the betrayal and the crash on Vareth 7. She told them about the poison in her daughter's blood and the dead moon where the future of the Ascendancy should have ended. And then she told them about the human. She did not use Callum's rank or his full name or any of the titles that had been hastily invented for him by confused protocol officers. She simply called him the Human, and she described what he had done in plain language without decoration or exaggeration. She said that he had found a dying child of a species that had given him every reason to be afraid, and he had picked her up. She said that he had spent a night fighting a fever he did not understand, with medicine that was not designed for the body he was trying to save, and he had not slept, and he had not stopped. She said that he had taken in a wounded Vrethkai who threatened to kill him, and he had set her broken arm and offered her water. She said that he had emptied every credit he possessed to buy medicine for a child he had known for 3 days, and when asked why, he had said it seemed like a fair trade. She said that he had stood between 6 armed assassins and a sleeping baby, with nothing but an old pistol and a refusal to move. And then she said the thing that silenced the hall so completely that Callum could hear his own heartbeat. "We prepared for humanity's ships," she said. "We studied their weapons and their tactics and their history of war, and we believed we understood what they were, and we were wrong. They are not conquerors, they are not predators, they are not any of the things we feared. They are caretakers. They cannot help it, it is woven into the structure of their minds. Deeper than thought, deeper than strategy, deeper than survival itself. They see something small and suffering, and they pick it up, they hold it, they fight for it, they give everything they have for it, even when the thing they carry is not theirs, even when it makes no sense, even when it could destroy them. We are the Vreth Ascendancy. We have conquered worlds and broken empires, and we are feared across the stars, and we could not protect our own princess from traitors in our own house. One human with an empty wallet and a broken ship did what 900 worlds could not." She turned and looked at Callum across the hall, and he met her gaze the way he always did, without flinching and without pretending to be anything other than what he was. "Any species capable of what this man did," Rithon said, "is not an enemy to be feared, but a partner to be treasured. And I will stake the honor of my broodline on that truth." The hall erupted. Everyone agreed, of course, because no decision in the history of any civilization had ever enjoyed unanimous support. And there were counselors who stood and argued and pounded their fists and declared that trusting humans was foolishness. And the debates would continue for months and years and probably centuries. But every time a counselor raised an objection, every time someone stood to argue against the pact, Bug would climb down from Callum's shoulders and toddle across the polished floor on unsteady legs, and climb back into his arms and fall asleep with her face pressed against his chest. And it is very hard to argue that humans are dangerous when their future queen treats one like a favorite blanket. The pact was ratified before the day was over. That evening, after the crowds had gone and the hall was empty, and the diplomats were busy doing whatever diplomats did when history happened around them, Callum sat on a balcony high on the spire of the royal palace and watched the sunset. Vreth Prime had 3 suns, and when they set they did it in stages, painting the sky in colors that human eyes had no names for, golds that were almost sounds, and purples that were almost tastes, and a deep shimmering green that felt like the beginning of a song. Bug was asleep in his lap, curled into a ball with her tail wrapped around his wrist, and her tiny claws hooked into his sleeve, and she was making a soft rumbling sound that he had learned was the Vrethkai equivalent of purring. Rithon sat beside him, not on a throne or a command chair, but on the stone floor of the balcony, with her legs folded beneath her, and she was not wearing her armor or her ceremonial bands, and without them she looked like what she was underneath all the titles, a mother, tired and grateful, and still a little broken from everything that had happened. "You could have walked away in that wreckage," she said, and her voice was quiet, stripped of the authority and the formality, just a person talking to another person at the end of a long day. "You could have left her there and no one in the galaxy would have known, and no one would have blamed you. Callum looked down at Bug, at her shimmering scales catching the light of 3 setting suns, at her tiny hand gripping his sleeve like an anchor, and he adjusted the little blanket he still wrapped her in every night, because old habits are the last things a man lets go of. "No," he said, "I really could not have." Rithon was quiet for a long time after that, watching the suns sink below the horizon one by one, and then she said something in Old Vrethkai, a single phrase spoken so softly that it barely stirred the air. Callum did not speak Old Vrethkai. He did not know the words or the grammar or the centuries of meaning packed into each syllable. But Bug stirred in her sleep and chirped once softly, as though she had heard and understood. Approved. P. And somehow, in a way he could not explain and did not try to, Callum understood it too. It meant family. Not the kind you are born into, but the kind you choose, the kind you build in the dark on a dead moon, with nothing but stubbornness and a refusal to let a child cry alone. Across the galaxy, in council chambers and war rooms and universities and bars, species would study the kinship pact for centuries. They would write papers about its political implications and its economic impact and its effect on the balance of power. They would build simulations and run projections and argue about what it meant for the future of civilization. Rithon told him everything during the final hours before they reached Threshold Station, and with every word, the weight of what Callum had stumbled into grew heavier. The crash was not an accident. A faction within the Ascendancy, generals who called themselves the Iron Clutch, had decided that Rithon's broodline was unfit to rule, that her policies of cautious expansion and measured diplomacy were weakness, and that the Empire needed a sovereign who would burn rather than build. They had planted an operative on her ship, someone she trusted, and that operative had sabotaged the engines over Verat 7 and poisoned the hatchling before the crash to make sure that even if Rithon survived, the heir would not. The poison was designed to mimic a natural fever, Rithon said, her voice flat and hard like a blade being drawn, so that if the body was found, no one would suspect murder. They would say the princess died from injuries sustained in the crash, and the Iron Clutch would step forward with their own candidate, and the Ascendancy would accept it because there would be no alternative. Callum sat with Bug in his arms and listened, and felt a cold anger building in the bottom of his stomach. Not the hot explosive kind he had known as a young soldier, but the slow and heavy kind that settled into bone and did not leave. "If she dies," Rithon said, "civil war, the Ascendancy fractures, the Iron Clutch seizes the core worlds, the outer territories rebel, hundreds of billions of lives thrown into chaos, because a handful of generals wanted more power." "She is not going to die," Callum said. Rithon looked at him, and he could not read her expression, but he could read her silence, and her silence said she wanted to believe him, but had spent too long being a queen to trust in anything as flimsy as wanting. Threshold Station appeared on the viewport an hour later, a massive ring of metal and light spinning slowly against the black, home to 100,000 beings from 50 different species who lived and traded and fought and loved in the narrow corridors between the stars. Callum docked the Penny Dreadful in a berth that cost him a third of his remaining credits, and carried Bug through the airlock, wrapped in his jacket, the way he had carried her from the wreckage, close to his chest, with her head tucked under his chin. Rithon walked beside him, and she had found a cloak somewhere in his cargo hold to cover her damaged armor and hide her features, because a wounded Vrethkai on a neutral station would draw attention, and a wounded Vrethkai queen would draw a war. The corridors of Threshold were crowded and loud and full of species that Callum recognized and species he did not, and every single one of them stopped and stared as he walked past. A human carrying a Vrethkai infant was not something anyone had ever seen, and the reactions ranged from confusion to disgust, to something that looked like fear. And Callum ignored all of them, because Bug was whimpering again and her scales were flickering, that terrible feverish orange. He found the xenobiology clinic on the station's medical ring, a small cluttered office run by a Pelori named Dr. Seni Talith, a bird-like creature with silver feathers and quick, clever eyes, who took one look at Bug and ushered them into the back without a single question about why a human was holding an alien baby. Dr. Talith ran scans that were 100 times more sophisticated than anything on the Penny Dreadful, and the results came back in minutes, and the doctor's feathers flattened against her skull in a way that Callum had learned to recognize as alarm. "This is not a natural illness," Dr. Talith said, her voice careful and precise. "This is chrysalis toxemia, a synthetic poison engineered to attack Vrethkai neural tissue. It was administered before the fever began, and it has been destroying her system from the start." Inside, Rithan made a sound that was not a word in any language, a low vibration that Callum felt in his chest more than he heard in his ears. "Can you cure it?" Callum said, and it was not a question. "The antitoxin exists," Dr. Talith said, "but the compounds required are rare and expensive, and I do not keep them in stock, because Vrethkai do not typically come to neutral stations for medical care." "How much?" Dr. Talith named a number. Callum had exactly that much in his accounts, the total sum of everything he had saved in 3 years of scraping and scavenging and living on cold rations in the cheapest berths the frontier had to offer. He transferred every credit without hesitation. Rithan watched him do it, watched him empty his entire life savings for a child that was not his, a child whose species had threatened him, a child whose mother had promised to kill him, and her clawed hands gripped the edge of the examination table so hard. The metal bent. "You will have nothing," she said. "I will have a kid who is not dying anymore," Callum said. "That seems like a fair trade." Dr. Talith administered the antitoxin, and within an hour, Bug's fever broke for the first time since the crash, and her scales shifted from gray and orange to a pale shimmering blue that was the most beautiful color Callum had ever seen on any living thing. He was holding her when the assassins found them. There were 6 of them, Vrethkai soldiers in unmarked armor, carrying weapons that hummed with a frequency Callum could feel in his teeth. And they came through the clinic door, fast and professional, and spread out in a formation that told Callum they were trained killers who had done this before. The leader, a massive Vrethkai with scars across his faceplate, pointed at Rython and spoke in Vrethkai, and Callum did not understand the words, but he understood the tone, the flat, certain tone of someone delivering a death sentence. Rython stood tall, despite her injuries, and her compound eyes burned, but she was unarmed and broken and outnumbered, and they all knew it. Callum moved without thinking about it. He stepped forward, putting himself between the kill team and the examination table where Bug lay, and he held the hatchling against his chest with his left arm, and drew the sidearm from his belt with his right hand, an old Earth-issue pistol that was laughably small compared to the weapons pointed at him. 6 Vrethkai warriors, each one 3 times his size, armed with technology that could cut through starship hull plating, looked at a single human with a child and an antique gun. "Move aside, human," the leader said in common. "This does not concern you. You are pointing weapons at a baby," Callum said, and his voice was steady in a way that surprised even him. "So yeah, it concerns me. That child is property of the Ascendancy, and you." "Child," Callum said, "is a kid who has been sick and scared and in pain for 3 days, and she just stopped crying for the first time an hour ago, and I am not going to let you be the reason she starts again." He did not raise his voice, and he did not make threats, and he did not deliver any kind of speech about honor or duty or the rights of the innocent. He just stood there, a 46-year-old man in dirty clothes, holding a sleeping alien princess against his heart with one hand and a pistol in the other. And everything about the way he stood said the same thing that his words said. which was that he was not going to move, not for 6 soldiers, not for 60, not for all 900 worlds of the Vreth Ascendancy. The kill team hesitated. And behind them, Rythan pressed a device hidden beneath her cloak. A signal pulsed outward from Threshold Station, not a distress call, but something older and deeper, a frequency reserved for a single purpose in the history of the Ascendancy. The Crown summons. The stars outside the station viewport shifted, and then they broke open, and the Crown Armada of the Vreth Ascendancy dropped out of hyperspace in a wall of metal and light and fury. 47 warships, each one large enough to cast a shadow across the station, each one bearing the sigil of the Queen. The kill team dropped their weapons before the first hail came through. Vrethkai's soldiers in royal armor flooded the station within minutes. Hundreds of them, moving with the terrifying precision of an empire that had conquered worlds. And they secured every corridor and every dock and every room until the station was theirs in everything but name. They came to the clinic, and they stopped in the doorway, a wall of 8-foot warriors in gleaming armor, and they stared at the scene in front of them. Their future queen, the heir to the Ascendancy, the Kavrethi Saran, was asleep in the arms of a human who still had not lowered his gun. Callum looked at Rethan. Rethan looked at Callum. "You can put the weapon down now," she said. He holstered the pistol and tried to hand Bug to the nearest soldier. But the moment the hatchling left his arms, she woke up and screamed. Not a cry of pain or fever, but a shriek of pure outraged fury. And she reached for Callum with both hands and would not stop until he took her back. The royal guard watched in complete silence as the future sovereign of 900 worlds buried her face in a human's shirt and refused to let go. Rethan stepped forward, no longer hiding behind a cloak, standing at her full height despite her wounds, and every soldier in the room dropped to one knee. She looked at Callum with eyes that held centuries of empire in them, and she said something very quiet. "It seems my daughter has chosen her guardian." Callum flew the Penny Dreadful through the dark between stars. With Bug sleeping in a makeshift crib he had built from a cargo crate lined with thermal blankets, and Rython sat in the co-pilot seat with her broken arm bound against her chest, and her good arms folded, and her compound eyes watching everything. She had started eating, which Callum took as progress, though she complained about every piece of food he offered her, and told him that human nutrition was barely one step above consuming rocks. She had also started talking, though she seemed to hate herself for it. It began with questions, sharp and probing, delivered like interrogation rather than conversation. "Why did you take the child from the wreckage?" Callum shrugged and adjusted their heading by 2 degrees to avoid a debris field his sensors had picked up ahead. "It was crying," he said. "Many things cry," Rython said. "Prey animals cry when they are caught. It does not mean you save them. I am not in the habit of comparing babies to prey animals. It is not your baby. No. It is not your species. No. You gain nothing from its survival." "That is correct." Rythan's mandibles clicked in what Callum had started to recognize as frustration. A sharp, rapid sound like someone tapping their fingernails on a table. "Then explain it to me," she said, and there was something underneath the demand that sounded almost like pleading, as though his answer mattered to her in a way she could not afford to let him see. Callum was quiet for a while, watching the stars slide past the viewport, and then he said, "Where I come from, there is a word called compassion, and it means you help things that are suffering because they are suffering, and that is the whole reason. There is no other part to it." "That is insane," Rythan said. "Maybe," Callum said, "but it is also the reason your kid is still alive. So, maybe insane is not always bad." She went quiet after that, but the next day she came back with something different. Not questions, but information, delivered in the flat tone of someone reading from a report. "The Ascendancy has studied your species extensively," she said, while Callum was feeding Bug with the dropper. The hatchling's tiny claws wrapped around his thumb. "That is not creepy at all," Callum said. "Our intelligence division compiled a behavioral analysis spanning 300 years of human recorded history," she continued, as though he had not spoken, "and the conclusion was that your species is the most psychologically unstable civilization in the known galaxy." "Flattering," Callum muttered. "You do not understand," Rhython said, and she leaned forward in her seat, her compound eyes catching the cabin light in ways that made them look like shattered glass. "Every other species the Ascendancy has encountered follows a pattern. They are aggressive or they are passive, they are territorial or they are nomadic. They are predictable, but humans—" She paused, and her mandibles clicked slowly. "Humans will wage wars against each other so brutal that the aftermath makes our generals uncomfortable. And then in the same generation, in the same year, sometimes in the same week, the same soldiers who burn cities will run into collapsing buildings to pull strangers from the fire." Callum looked at her and said nothing. "You form attachment bonds with everything," she said. "Not just your own young, but the young of other species. Not just living things, but machines and vehicles and abstract concepts. You name your ships and mourn them when they are destroyed. You adopt orphaned animals from species that could kill you. You write stories about falling in love with aliens you have never met. Some of those stories are pretty good, actually. Your pair-bonding instinct has no boundaries," Rhython said, and her voice had dropped lower now, almost to a whisper. "And that is what frightens the High Command. Not your weapons, which are modest, not your ships, which are slow, not your armies, which are small, but the fact that you will bond with anything, protect anything, fight for anything that you have decided belongs to you. And you make that decision based on nothing more than proximity and suffering." She looked at Bug, who was dozing in Callum's arms, with nutrient paste smeared across its tiny face. "My people spent decades preparing for human warships," she said quietly. "We built weapons and trained soldiers and fortified borders, and none of it prepared us for this. For what? For a man who finds a dying child in the wreckage of an enemy ship and simply picks it up." Callum wiped Bug's face with his sleeve and said, "I think you are overthinking this, and I think you do not understand what you are," Rhython said. The conversation stayed with Callum through the rest of the day, sitting in the back of his mind like a stone in his shoe. Not painful, but impossible to ignore. That evening, while Rhython slept and Bug dozed in its crib, he docked briefly at a relay station to top off his water supply. And while the tanks were filling, he used the station's more complete database to look up the word that had been nagging at him since the first night: Kav-Rethis. The old database on his ship had flagged it, but could not translate it, and he had been too busy keeping the hatchling alive to think about it. But now, in the quiet of the relay station, with better systems at his fingertips, he typed the word in and waited. The translation loaded in 3 seconds. Kav-Rethis, Brood Queen Designate, firstborn of the ruling clutch, future sovereign of the Vreth Ascendancy. Callum read it twice. Then he read it a third time. Then he turned very slowly and looked through the viewport at his ship. Inside, sleeping on a cot he had bought second-hand from a junk dealer on Kepler Station, was a baby who would one day rule 900 worlds. He walked back to the Penny Dreadful with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and he stepped through the airlock and stood in the dim cabin looking at the hatchling in its cargo crate crib, its tiny wing membranes twitching in its sleep, its scales still dull with fever, but flickering now and then with hints of color that were almost beautiful. Then he looked at Rhython. She was already awake, watching him from her corner of the cabin with those shattered glass eyes, and he knew from the way she held herself that she had been expecting this moment, had been waiting for it, had been dreading it. "Now you understand," she said, and her voice was very calm and very controlled. "Why I have not killed you yet." Callum opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Bug is a queen," he said. Rythan repeated, and something crossed her alien face that might have been amusement or might have been horror. "Is the heir to the largest empire in this arm of the galaxy." "I have been feeding your princess with a dropper," Callum said. "Yes. And I named her Bug." "Yes, and you did not think to mention this." Rythan's compound eyes held his gaze without blinking, because Vrethkai could not blink. "If I had told you what she was," she said, "would you have treated her any differently?" Callum thought about this for exactly 1 second. "No," he said. "No," Rythan said, "and that human is exactly why I did not tell you." Bug chirped in her sleep, and her tiny clawed hand reached out into the empty air, grasping for something, and without thinking, Callum reached down and let her wrap her fingers around his, and she went still and peaceful again. Rythan watched this with eyes that had commanded fleets and ordered the pavement. "Death of worlds," and she said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the human had not already answered with that single unconscious gesture. He did not care what Bug was. He only cared that she was small and sick and needed him. And Rythan, queen of the Vreth Ascendancy, ruler of 900 worlds, terror of the galactic rim, sat in the dark of a human junk ship and felt something crack open inside her chest that no amount of armor had ever been able to protect. He sat on the floor beside his cot, with his back against the wall, and his medkit spread out in front of him, every vial and patch and injector he owned, laid out in a row, and he tried them one by one on the hatchling, because he had no idea which ones would work and which ones would kill it. The fever would not break. He adjusted the temperature in the cabin 3 times, first warmer, because the hatchling was shivering, then cooler, because its scales started to crack from the heat, then somewhere in between, where it seemed to breathe a little easier. He mixed water with a nutrient paste designed for human recovery, and thinned it until it was almost clear, then used a dropper to place tiny amounts on the hatchling's tongue, and each time the little creature swallowed, he felt a wave of relief, so strong it made his hands shake. Around the 3rd hour, the hatchling started screaming, not the thin warbling cry from the wreckage, but a full shriek that filled the cabin, and rattled the metal walls, and its body arched, and its tiny claws dug into the blanket, and Callum could see its scales flickering between dull gray and a feverish orange. He picked it up and held it against his chest, and walked back and forth across the cabin, rocking it the way he had seen parents rock their children in the colonies, and he talked to it, just kept talking in a low and steady stream. "You are okay. You are going to be fine. I know it hurts, but you are safe now. I have got you. I'm not going anywhere." He didn't know if Vrethkai hatchlings could understand tone or rhythm, but after 20 minutes, the screaming faded to a whimper, and then to silence, and the hatchling pressed its face into his neck and went still, its breathing rough but steady. He named it Bug, not because he thought it was an insect, but because it was small and it clung to things, and because he needed to call it something other than the hatchling. Lose his mind. By morning, Bug had stabilized, not well but alive, the fever still present but no longer climbing, and its dark eyes followed Callum whenever he moved around the cabin, and when he came close, it would reach for him with those tiny clawed hands and chirp until he picked it up. Callum held it against his shoulder and ate a cold ration bar with one hand, and told himself he was going to figure this out. He needed fuel, he needed better medicine, and he needed to get to a station where someone who actually knew Vrethkai biology could look at this child. But first, he needed to do an external check of his ship, because the Penny Dreadful had a habit of developing new problems every time she sat still for more than 12 hours. He put Bug down on the cot, surrounded it with folded blankets so it would not roll off, and stepped outside through the airlock. The wind had died down during the night, and the gray dust lay flat and still under a sky the color of iron. And Callum walked around the hull checking for cracks and leaks and anything that might kill him during takeoff. He found the Vrethkai female collapsed against his starboard landing strut. She was tall, even crumpled on the ground, easily 8 feet if she had been standing, and she wore armor that had been shattered and torn away in places, exposing dark scaled skin underneath that was bruised and bleeding, and one of her 4 arms was bent at an angle that made Callum wince just looking at it. Her compound eyes opened when he approached, dozens of tiny lenses catching the dull light, and she hissed at him, with a sound like steam escaping a broken pipe. "Do not come closer, human," she said in Galactic Common, her voice rough and broken and thick with pain. "Do not touch me. Do not touch the child. You will die for what you have done." Callum looked at her for a long moment. She was injured badly enough that she could not stand. Alone on a dead moon, with no ship and no supplies, and she was threatening to kill him. He had met people like this before. Not Vrethkai, but soldiers, wounded and cornered, and so full of pain and fear that the only thing left was anger. "Can you walk?" he asked. She hissed again, louder. "I asked if you can walk," he repeated, "because I am not carrying you and a baby at the same time. So if you want to come inside, you are going to have to help me out here." Her compound eyes shifted, dozens of lenses refocusing, and for a moment the hissing stopped, and she just stared at him, as though he had said something in a language she did not know existed. He helped her up. It took a long time, because she was heavy and her broken arm kept catching on things, and she growled every time he touched her. But he got her through the airlock and onto the floor of the cabin, and he propped her against the wall and went to get his medkit. "Do not," she started. "Your arm is broken in 2 places," Callum said without looking at her, "and you have at least 3 deep lacerations that are going to get infected as I do not clean them. So you can threaten to kill me after I am done." He set her arm as best he could using a splint designed for human bones, which was not ideal, but was better than nothing, and he cleaned her wounds with antiseptic that made her snarl and snap her mandibles at him, and he offered her water from a canteen that she stared at for 30 seconds before taking. Bug from the cot let out a chirp. The Vrethkai female went rigid, every muscle in her body locking at once, and her eyes fixed on the hatchling with an intensity that made the air in the cabin feel heavy. "It is okay," Callum said. "The fever is still high, but it is not getting worse. I have been keeping it hydrated and—" "You know nothing about what that child needs," she said, but her voice had changed, the anger still there, but layered over something else, something raw and desperate that she was trying very hard to hide. "You are right," Callum said, "which is why I need to get to a station where someone does. And since you clearly know more about Vrethkai biology than I do, you can either help me keep this kid alive, or you can sit there and threaten me while I figure it out alone." She told him her name was Rython, and nothing else, and she would not explain how the ship had crashed, or why she had been on it, or what her relationship to the hatchling was. But she watched him. She watched him all through that day and into the evening, watched him check on Bug every hour, watched him adjust the temperature and the humidity and the light levels based on how the hatchling responded, watched him fall asleep sitting up with Bug curled on his chest because the child would not stop crying unless it could feel his heartbeat. She watched him with those compound eyes that could see in spectrums humans could not imagine, and she could not make sense of what she was seeing. In Vrethkai culture, there were only 2 reasons to care for a child: because it was yours, or because you had been ordered to by someone who outranked you. This human had no reason at all, and yet he held her daughter as though she were the most precious thing he had ever touched. Late that night, when Callum's breathing had gone slow and deep, and Bug was sleeping peacefully on his chest for the first time, Rithan reached out with her one good arm and touched the hatchling's head with a gentleness that would have shocked anyone who knew what she was. Her hand was shaking. She pulled it back before the human could wake, and she sat in the dark and listened to him breathe and felt something she had not felt since the assassins had come for her ship. The wind on Varith 7 never stopped screaming, and Callum Wren had long since stopped caring about it. He pulled his scarf tighter around his face and walked across the gray dust, his boots crunching against frozen rock with every step, his eyes scanning the horizon for anything worth taking back to his ship. Callum was 46 years old, retired from the United Earth Marines, and currently making a living the only way a man with no connections and no ambition could, by picking through the garbage the galaxy left behind. His ship, an old cargo hauler called the Penny Dreadful, sat a kilometer behind him, ugly and dented and barely holding together, but she flew, and that was enough for him. He had come to this dead moon because his scanners had picked up a fresh crash signature, and fresh crashes meant fresh salvage, and fresh salvage meant he could eat for another month. What he found when he reached the crash site made him stop walking. Was enormous, spread across half a kilometer of gray earth, metal twisted and burning in places where the fuel cells had not yet gone cold, and the design of the hull was unmistakable. Vrethkai. Callum let out a slow breath through his teeth and stood very still for a long moment. The Vrethkai were not the kind of aliens you wanted to run into. Not out here. Not anywhere, really, because the Vrethkai were an empire of 900 worlds, ruled by insectoid creatures who stood 8 feet tall and had 4 arms and compound eyes that could see in the dark, and absolutely no sense of humor about anything. Humanity had met them only a handful of times, and every meeting had been tense and formal, and full of the unspoken understanding that the Vrethkai could crush Earth's modest fleet, if they ever decided humans were worth the trouble. Callum should have turned around right then and walked back to his ship and flown away, and never thought about this place again, but salvage was salvage, and he was hungry, and dead Vrethkai did not file complaints. He moved into the wreckage carefully, stepping over shattered hull plating and sparking conduits, his flashlight cutting through the smoke and dust, looking for anything he could pull free and sell at the next station. He found nothing useful in the first section, just ruined equipment and shattered displays covered in Vrethkai script he could not read. And he was about to give up and try the aft section when he heard it. A sound. Thin and high and trembling, like a bird caught in a wire, rising and falling in a pattern that was too regular to be mechanical, and too desperate to be anything but alive. Callum froze and listened, and the sound came again, weaker this time, a warbling cry that echoed through the broken corridors of the dead ship. He followed it. He did not think about whether this was smart, or safe, or profitable, because the sound was the kind of sound that bypassed the thinking parts of a man's brain and went straight to something older and deeper, something that lived in the chest and not the head. He crawled through a collapsed doorway, squeezed past a beam that had fallen at an angle, and found himself in what must have been a private chamber, the walls lined with some kind of soft material that was now torn and scorched. And there, in the corner, half buried under a fallen panel, was a hatchling. It was small enough to fit in both his arms, covered in iridescent scales that should have been bright, but were instead dull and cracked and flaking, and it had tiny wing membranes along its arms that were shriveled and pressed flat against its body, and it was shaking so hard that Callum could hear its scales rattling against the metal floor. Its eyes were closed and its mouth was open, and it was making that sound, that terrible thin crying sound, and when Callum knelt beside it and carefully lifted the panel off its body, it flinched and cried louder. He pulled off his glove and touched its forehead the way he would have touched a sick child's forehead, and even through alien skin he could feel it. The hatchling was burning with fever, hot enough to make him pull his hand back. "Hey," he said softly, even though he knew it could not understand him. "Hey, take it easy. I am right here." The hatchling opened its eyes, and they were huge and dark and wet with something that looked very much like tears. And it stared up at him with an expression that needed no translation across any species barrier in the galaxy. It was afraid, and it was in pain, and it was alone. Callum Wren had done many stupid things in his life, and he had survived most of them through luck rather than wisdom. And he knew with absolute certainty that what he was about to do was the stupidest thing yet. The Vrethkai did not forgive aliens who touched their young. Not a fine or a prison sentence, but something far more permanent and far more painful. He knew this. He looked at the hatchling looked at him. "All right," he said, and he took off his jacket and wrapped the small trembling body in it, lifting it against his chest with both arms, feeling it shudder and then slowly press closer to his warmth, its tiny clawed hands gripping his shirt, its crying fading to a whimper. He carried it out of the wreckage and into the screaming wind, and he did not look back. If he had looked back, he might have seen something moving in the shadows of the ruined ship, a tall figure dragging itself through the debris, one of its four arms hanging broken at its side, its compound eyes locked on the human who was walking away with a child that was worth more than every ship in the galaxy combined. But Callum did not look back, because the hatchling was burning up against his chest, and that was the only thing in the world that mattered. Universe that mattered to him right now. He got back to the Penny Dreadful and sealed the airlock behind him and laid the hatchling on his cot and ran every scan his old medical equipment could manage. The results came back garbled and incomplete because the system was designed for humans and had only a basic xenobiology module that was at least 10 years out of date. But it told him enough. The hatchling's temperature was dangerously high, its hydration was critical, and its biosignature carried a classification tag he had never seen before. Kavrithis. Callum stared at the word for a moment, then dismissed it, because he did not speak Vrethkai, and he did not have time to learn. The hatchling was dying, and that was a problem he understood. He filled a clean cloth with water and pressed it gently against the hatchling's forehead. And when it whimpered, he started talking to it in a low, steady voice, the way his mother had talked to him when he was small, and sick and scared. Just nonsense words meant to say, "I am here, and you are not alone, and I will not let anything hurt you." Outside, the wind screamed across the dead moon, and somewhere in the darkness behind his ship, a figure with broken armor and burning eyes pressed herself against the landing strut and listened to the humans singing to her daughter. And for the first time in her long and violent life, the queen of the Vreth Ascendancy did not know what to do.